There's something I'm dying to talk to you about, and I unfortunately this is going to require a little bit of a disclaimer here because I think I know what the question is, but I don't really have the position from which to ask it, and so I need to say a little bit about my own history before I ask a question that I think we will both agree is not my place to ask. So your story and mine are not remotely similar, but there is an interesting parallel. So I read about you the story that you recount earlier of having been kicked out of madrasa for asking too many questions or the wrong kind of questions.
Yeah.
So here's my story. I grew up in a very secular home. We were culturally Jewish, but there was nothing invested in Judaism as a religion. And as my friends were, many of my friends were Jewish, getting bar mitzvah and the like, or heading towards it. And I felt a bit left out. What was this thing? And in fact, my best friend when I was quite young, Aaron, came from a household. To be honest, I couldn't tell you. I still don't know what they actually believe, but I know that they were observant, right? So I spent many seders at their house, and I got to see what a non-secular Jewish home looked like. And so, in any case, at some point, I actually asked to go to shul and to figure out what this thing was. And I went, and I was thoroughly disappointed. And the reason that I was disappointed, I was allowed to ask questions, but the answers were nonsense. And I knew they were nonsense. And so what was the point? Why, school was already a problem for me. I wasn't any good at it. And that revealed something about what was wrong with it. And here I was choosing to go to more school. And when I asked questions that I knew were perfectly good questions, the answers that came back were gobbledygook. And so I left. And in some ways, I think that that's a bit of a tragic story because, that was it was just I dipped my toe in the water somewhere, and had I done it in some in a different building in a different part of town, I might have had a different experience. But what I got, I took to be representative, and I paid very little attention to Judaism directly from that point forward until I started to realize my error as an adult. In any case, it leads me here. There is a question about why Islam is the way it is. And there is no doubt there's a tremendous amount of violence inherent to the doctrine in the Quran. But you could say the very same thing about the Torah. It's in there too. And so there's a concept which I have played with. I've also heard Eric has a formulation of it. And the idea is that there's a distinction between these two traditions. And the distinction is about the mechanism through which religious dogma is updated. That Judaism effectively has a living rabbinical tradition that interprets the doctrine in light of modern realities, right? So we don't spend so much time on the details of Moses's laws of war, which are perfectly abhorrent, because it's not relevant. And in fact, it is in conflict with the modern world. So it is de-emphasized by a living tradition. And that in Islam, and you correct me if I have this wrong, in Islam, there is actually a prohibition, effectively, against update. And I don't know how much you know about my evolutionary conjecture about what religion is, but what I have said is that religions are literally false, but metaphorically true. Metaphorically true means that we take things that actually put a lineage at advantage and encode them in stories that are not factual, but that result in adaptive behavior. That mechanism is subject to capture, right? So the story of Jesus flipping over the money changers' tables in the temple is one of a rebellion against capture, effectively. Right. Martin Luther, having challenged indulgences in the Catholic Church, is a challenge to a kind of capture. And that Islam has encoded resistance to capture in the prohibition against prophets after Muhammad. How am I doing so far?
I think you're getting the broad strokes quite right. There are some interpretive issues here that I'll certainly talk about in a second. But so far, I hear you.
Okay, so the question is, every tradition has what I would call an analog to virus protection. The way you might have virus protection on your computer, religious texts have a way to prevent people from capturing the voice of God and using it for their own benefit. And preventing new prophets would be one such mechanism. And, a rabbinical class that has license to shut down bad schools of thought, for example, might be another. But the question is, A, is there something to the idea that in the ancient world there was a great deal of brutality? That brutality has traveled more easily through time with Islam because its particular version of resistance to bad ideas prevents update, and therefore modernity is a bigger leap. Does that strike you as correct?
It strikes me as potentially correct. Now, let me explain why potentially. And let me start by saying that um, if I believed that Islam as a faith or a religion was incapable of reinterpretation, I could not have integrity as a Muslim. I would have to leave the religion. But I don't believe that because it's one thing how the practitioners of a religion on the whole behave is obviously a demonstration of what they believe, but it is not a demonstration of what is possible. And so, for example, most Muslims don't even know, Brett, that the Quran, Islam scripture, contains 3 times as many verses calling on Muslims to think, ask questions, analyze, rethink, and decide for themselves than verses that tell us to just submit to this or that. 3 times as many verses. Um, Most Muslims have, and I'm talking about globally now, have never been exposed to the idea that I picked up at the public library, namely that Islam has its own tradition of independent thinking, of creative reasoning and dissent and debate, and yeah, reinterpretation. It's a tradition known as ijtihad, not jihad, although even that word does not mean violence. It's the connotation that militants have given it that now conjures up violence in our heads. But ijtihad is all about struggling with the complexity of the world. And there are plenty of, again, power hungry theologians. Some would say that's a redundant phrase, I know, but power hungry theologians who would argue that, the Irshad Manjis of this world would like you to believe that, that ijtihad is open to all Muslims. But no, it's not. You need a certain amount of scholarship. And even lesser known scholars have pointed out that the one right under the umbrella of ijtihad that all Muslims have is to decide for themselves what scholars to follow, so that those scholars who argue that ijtihad is something that all Muslims need to exercise and have both the responsibility and the right to exercise, one can choose to follow those scholars, not simply the louder, more institutionally backed who hang on to their power by telling us you cannot think for yourself, right? So all of this is simply to say that the fact is that it is we Muslims who need reform. And in reforming ourselves, we thereby reform Islam. But Islam itself has the raw materials to overcome what has been abused in its name. I'll just finish up by saying something that, I remember when Bill Clinton was president, and more than once I heard him say, and I was pretty young at the time, and I was struck by this, that there is nothing wrong with America that cannot be fixed by what is right with America. And I must tell you that that is exactly how I view my relationship with Islam.